And she folded and smoothed the tunic and hung it on a peg beside the corded bedstead, and then went forth from the chamber, drawing the door to by its silver handle, and driving the bolt home with the thong. So there, all the night through, wrapped in a fleece of wool, he pondered in his mind upon the journey which Athena had shown. Remember, last time we had ended on that particular passage when Telemachus is going to bed in his own bed. I think Mr. Quinn had said it's a perfect moment to mark the end of his adolescence and the beginning of his youth. And that just happens to be our subject in one sense. I guess we have a lot of different ways of talking about subjects. Philosophers talk about material subjects and formal subjects. I don't know, literary people aren't quite that meticulous about their words, but we certainly do use the word subject in several senses. That is, in a broad sense, you can say our subject is poetry. But poetry, after all, is an imitation of life. And we're not talking about all poetry at the moment. We're talking about this particular poem. And we are teaching students at a particular age. And our subject, poetry, is related to this particular poem, and it's related to our students. And college, those 4 years of the study of the liberal arts, or the humanities as they've come to be called, happened to coincide, and quite properly coincide, with that transition that everybody has to make between adolescence and youth. And that's what this is about right here at the end of the first book of the 24 books of the Odyssey. That is, Telemachus is starting out on a journey. And this is a journey, an adventure, the first one that he's ever had on his own. He's entirely on his own. He's no longer a child. He's no longer under the governance of his nurse or under the governance of his mother. He's certainly not of his father, who's been lost to him for all these years. And Homer dwells so lovingly on those last details of his childhood. And she folded and smoothed the tunic and hung it on a peg. I suppose when a young man goes off to college, one of the first things he learns is to hang up his own clothes. As if he learns anything. We like to think that we're going to learn subjects in a sense of mathematics and literature and whatever subjects we're studying. But poetry has as its subject manners, mores in the Latin sense of the word, what people do, customs, not the intellectual reflection on those things, which would be the science of ethics or even the science of anthropology, I suppose. That is the scientific description of mores, but rather the mores themselves, that is the customs and the habits. What after all are manners? Manners are a set of habits that we have to learn before we can enter into a responsible life. And children don't have any manners. You can train children and make them mind, but the motive is obedience. But they haven't got the habit. As I said a minute ago, what Telemachus has to do from now on is hang up his clothes by himself. Not because his nurse is there to do it for him or there to tell him to do it. There's no more nagging now. He has to set forth on a journey, and all of those things have to be taken for granted.
There was a comic version of this that I heard on the radio last week. Perhaps you heard this show where Garrison Keillor was talking about a young man. It's kind of not his usual story, but it's a story about a young man who gets in his car and he goes out driving along the highway and he has a terrible wreck. And it turns out that he's killed his own parents. He's run into their car, but they're dying. They're dying out there by the roadside, and he gets out and he says, do you have any last words, Pa? And his father says, well, do you think you can make your own breakfast in the morning? Mm-hmm. And he says, now, before you open the new milk carton, first finish off the old milk carton. He tells him he keeps right on doing what he's done all his life, trying to get him to do these things, because from now on he's going to have to do this all by himself. But that's exactly what it is. You tell children up to a certain age, you keep telling them all the right things to do, and usually they don't do it. Although that's what you're doing, is you're preparing them for manners. And and then one day they go away and they have to do it by themselves.
Telemachus is exactly at the right age. That is, he's learned his manners. That is, he's ready to go. I think we can say that. For example, in just a few lines before that speech, when Athena, the goddess Athena, decides to help him find his father, and she flies down from Mount Olympus. This is right at the beginning of the whole poem. She flies down, disguises herself, as the gods always do, in the form of a particular man, and stands at the gate as a stranger to be invited in, and then she will give her advice in the guise of this stranger. And just cut into that scene, for example, it says, the godlike Telemachus was the first to see her, for he was sitting among the wooers, sad at heart in thought about his noble father. Should he perchance come from somewhere and make a scattering of the wooers in the palace, and himself win honor and rule over his own house? And he thought of these things sitting among the wooers. He beheld Athena, and he went straight to the outer door, for in his heart he counted it shame that a stranger should stand long at the gates. Well, you could just stop right there. He counted it shame that a stranger should stand long at the gates. Now, there's nothing of the ethical about this. We're not dealing here with moralia. We're not dealing with the moral choice. We're not dealing here with any obligation. He just has the habit of good manners. When a stranger comes, you feel ashamed to let him stand there long, and so you go out and invite him in. So, where does that come from? It doesn't come from an intellectual decision. It doesn't come from that process that culminates in an ethical act. This is pre-ethical. It operates really on the level of the senses and of the internal senses. Those habits of observation. First of all, he's the only one in this crowd of ill-mannered people. As if you want to describe the suitors, they're not really evil. They're ill-mannered. That's what's wrong with them. I don't suppose there's anything that they've done which would be against the moral order, but they don't behave themselves properly. They eat and drink, and they overstay their welcome, and they're surly, and they care only about themselves. They swill down the drink and gobble up the food, and don't give a thought for anybody else. That's really what's the matter with them.
We call it the order of the appropriate, or the seemly, or the comely. Sometimes
Decent.
the decent. Yeah, that's all of those words are words that have to do with manners. The suitors are behaving in an unseemly way, and you would say they don't have good table manners. That's where manners show up so often, is at the table, and in all of your demeanor, we call it your demeanor. This is a very important distinction that we're making here, and it's one that is really not made very much. Cicero, somewhere, says, manners make man. I mean, that's the way it's usually paraphrased. That became the motto for some very, very early colleges in England. I'm trying to think of the name of the first college. There was a man, one particular man. He's not very well known now, and I don't think I'm going to be able to come up with his name. But he founded 3 colleges back in the Middle Ages, and the motto for these colleges all was "Manners maketh man." I saw a book the other day, or I looked at a book the other day that had the title "Morals Maketh Man," and that's really not right. The morals are, of course, essential to a good human life, but what really makes the man, to begin with, the foundation for morals is manners, and that is what is being dealt with in this particular place, especially in connection with this young man, because that's the first step. What we see in Telemachus by his treatment of Mentes is
that's Athena, disguised as
Mentes, is good manners. It says, "Welcome, sir." He goes up to Mentes. He says, "Welcome, sir, to our hospitality. You can tell us what has brought you when you have had some food." He doesn't think it's appropriate to ask him who he is or to ask him what his mission is until he has given him some food.
You remember that became one of the famous laws of the Old West.
Yeah.
That is, when the cowboy stranger rode up to the ranch house, the rancher would say, "Light and rest, stranger," but no questions were ever asked. Where did you come from, or where are you going, or why are you here? That's not good manners.
Well, you'll see that, of course, repeated over and over again in this book. It's a recurring theme.
But then after they've eaten, they always say, "Tell us your story."
Yes.
Once those elemental courtesies have been satisfied, then of course it's also part of the courtesy that a man will tell his story.
Yeah. Well, it isn't even expected to identify yourself. No. You're not. It's a kind of intrusion to ask somebody who they are. It's a kind of challenge, as if you don't trust them or something of that sort. You have to provide these things that we call the amenities. He says, "Once inside the lofty hall, he," that's Telemachus, "took her spear," Pallas Athene's spear, "and put it away by one of the great pillars on a wooden rack, with a number of other spears belonging to the stalwart Odysseus. He then conducted her to a carved chair, over which he spread a rug, and seated her there with a stool for her feet. For himself, he drew up an inlaid easy chair well away from the crowd of suitors for fear that his guest might take offense at the uproar, and finding himself in such ill-mannered company, turn with distaste from his meal.
See every one of those details, too. Manners, we begin with manners, but then manners move out, don't they, to include customs. That is, the way Telemachus behaves has to do with the way everybody behaves within his culture. And that includes the kind of chairs that they sit on. Manners, in the wide sense, begins to include interior decoration, for want of a better word.
The furnishings of life really have to do with manners. The furniture that we use, that we sit on or eat at, that place the stool for our feet, but then our clothing, our equipment. That is, Athena has a spear in her hand, and that's part of her furnishings, you would say, and that has to be disposed of properly. All of these, the
everything has a place.
Yeah, they immediately says, presently a maid came with water in a handsome golden jug and poured it out over a silver basin, so they could rinse their hands. She then drew a polished table to their side, and the staid housekeeper brought some bread and set it by them with a choice of dainties, helping them liberally to all she could offer. All of those, the dishes and the bowl, water, all of those are the furnishings that have to do with appropriate manners.
So we begin to move out to include those things that we commonly cover by the word civilized or even culture. We're not talking about civilization in any fancy sense. That is, again, I'm afraid in modern times we get the idea that civilization and culture have to do with the structure of classes and certain movements in history. But we're talking about something more elementary. They do have to do with those things, but we're talking about, again, something more elementary than that. Let's just take a single thing like the chair. Suppose last time we had said that you can't get into the kingdom of heaven without poetry. Well, we say that with a smile, of course. Perhaps we're exaggerating, but we're trying to exaggerate a truth when we say that. Now suppose we say Western civilization depends upon the existence of the discovery of the chair. Oriental civilizations don't have chairs. The characteristic of the Hindu is that he sits on the floor and folds his knees and his legs in a certain rather difficult posture. And we Westerners can't do that. We get swollen joints when we try to do that kind of thing. That is, we are habituated to the chair and the table that goes with it, and the dishes and the goblets that go with it. The Romans, you remember, got into the couch and to reclining on the couch. And fortunately, I think, civilization looked upon that as kind of a byway and got back to the table and the chair. I don't know, I'm not talking here I don't want to talk here like an archaeologist. I don't know the precise history of those things. But it is, I think, very significant that right here at the beginning of the Odyssey, we're introduced to this whole subject of manners by chairs and tables. And the way we think is conditioned by those habits that we have. Whenever you want to think about anything really serious, if you want to talk to somebody, you draw up a chair in our civilization. There are certain characteristic ways in which we behave. Aristotle walked, which is another important thing to do. When he taught, remember Aristotle's famous school was called the peripatetic school, the walking school, because he strolled up and down in his garden while the students followed, listening. And he discoursed as he walked in that slow and deliberate pace, back and forth, up and down the garden. And yes, that's a characteristic way of teaching. But it's more common for the teacher to sit in a chair. The bishop sits when he teaches. It is frequently said of our Lord in the scriptures that he sat. Now, if you want to give an oration, you stand. But for that quieter, more personal mode of discourse, we sit, and we sit characteristically in a chair. Well,
you see pictures. If you see medieval pictures of the teacher, the master, you'll find him most frequently. You'll find him seated with his pupils around him.
Now, what we're trying to call attention to here is something we were talking about last time, that when you read a poem, you should consider the accidents more seriously than you do the essence. Again, Aristotle, we take him as our master because he's just so intelligent, and he thought through these things and reduced them to their principles. He was the philosopher par excellence, the scientist who examined the matter and then drew from that matter its principles, which is not what we're doing, but we build on him in order to explain what we're doing. We borrow from him. And Aristotle said of poetry that the plot is the soul of it, what we call the plot. Actually, the word he uses is closer to the story, that is the movement from the beginning to the crisis to the finish. It's that myth is the actual Greek word that he uses. He says myth is the soul of, well, the exact quotation is the soul of tragedy, because he happens to be talking about tragedy, but it's been generalized out to mean all story, all poetry, whether dramatic or narrative. And so we would say that if you wanted to get at the essence of the Odyssey, you'd begin to talk about the myth, that is the motion of the thing from beginning to crisis to end. And we talk about Odysseus, because this is the story of Odysseus, who is far from home and is prevented from getting there. That's the condition at the beginning, and it rises to the great crisis when he finally comes home. And there's a certain debate, as we had said before, about when the exact moment of crisis comes. Some people argue that it's in those one or of those various discovery scenes. Others argue that it has to do with the moment when he kills the suitors. But it's certainly then, when he comes back, when he kills the suitors and he's recognized by his wife and his father, and he's home again. That's the crisis.
We don't get up to the story in this poem until book 4.
Well, Telemachus, for example, isn't really part of the story. He's a sidelight of the story, isn't he?
Yeah.
And yet we begin with him.
The first 4 books of the Odyssey have to do with Telemachus. Sometimes it's called the Telemachiad, as a kind of separate story. But actually, it isn't a story. It's perhaps the beginning of the story. But for those 4 books, we deal with the travels of Telemachus, and it really isn't until book 5 that we get up to Odysseus at all. And really, not until even the end of Book 5, where Hermes comes to Calypso's island, that the story really begins. And so you may many people have felt that, or I think rather inexperienced readers think that, well, you're kind of wasting time there at the beginning. It's a very long preparation for the story.
I suppose if you made a movie of this, there was a movie, some awful thing.
Yeah.
I remember actually seeing it years ago, and I forgot. Memory can do you favors sometimes by forgetting. But I'll bet you now that it didn't begin this way at all. It began with the story. If you want to make a good, fast-moving movie out of it, you've got to begin with Odysseus looking out at sea, wondering how he's going to get home, because that's when the story actually begins. And why does Homer waste all this time? Well, poetry is all a waste of time. We would go back to the beginning. What did we say about this? That it had to do with leisure. It didn't really have to do with action. Now, a story is the imitation of an action. But the action, and the action, if you will, is the essence of poetry. But the poetry is that cocoon that is spun around the action. The silk is more important than the worm. The action is going on there somewhere at the center, but all of these fine threads that are being spun out and out and out, that's the stuff that people are likely to make the mistake of throwing away. And that's what the whole poem is about. Those lines that Mr. Quinn just read, every single one of them can be read again and again and again. We're reading from two different translations here. It's kind of funny because they're quite far off, but still they say the same thing. Athena herself he led and seated on a chair, spreading a linen cloth beneath. A beautiful chair, richly wrought, and below was a footstool for the feet. Notice how, again, he dwells on that chair and goes into the detail of it says a rug was thrown over it in the translation you have here. And this particular word is described as a linen cloth. I'm sure the archaeologists debate exactly what it was. But Homer dwells with great love on these chairs and on the footstool. And our eye is brought to look at those things and to care about those things. Why? Well, because they're important. I remember someone once saying, well, no chair is that important. Why don't we go on with the story? Well, in poetry, themes are more important than men. Now, again, that's not exactly true. It's an exaggeration, but it brings the truth home. Sure, the poet wants to tell this story, but he does everything under the sun except tell it. And isn't that what storytellers, good storytellers, always do?
Well, you'll find when you get to the story, of course, you'll find that the story is a very digressive one, and that it is really very slow moving, and that Odysseus, who is one of the greatest of all storytellers, he is particularly noted for that. Odysseus himself is a great storyteller. He has been the hero of his own story. He makes stories, as it were. He lives stories, but he's also a great storyteller. And you will find that he too does exactly what Homer does here. That is, he dwells for long periods of time over details, particular things that are that he sees or that are involved in some way in the story?
I don't know if you've ever read plot summaries. You can buy books that give you the outlines of all the famous plots. You can go off to a college bookstore and pick up a little college guide to the poetry of Homer, let's say. And there will be a complete outline of the Odyssey, probably in a page or two. And it's just ridiculous. Some of you might have memories of the Metropolitan Opera radio program that comes on every Saturday. It's I guess the longest lived program, isn't it, in the whole world? It's been going on and on and on throughout my lifetime, anyway. And the radio announcer always gives in synopsis the plot. Well, of course, operas have the most fantastically complicated plots, and those things are just ridiculous. You get the giggles when you listen to the Duke who is in disguise pretending to be a shepherd, and the Countess who is also in disguise pretending to be something else, and they go off to the county fair, and this happens and that happens, and someone else turns out to be somebody else, and by the time you're a couple of minutes into it, you've lost it. It spills over on the floor, and you can't remember it anyway. Imagine going through the plots of Shakespeare's plays. What could be more ridiculous, really, and less rewarding? Whereas when you think of a Shakespeare play, what comes to mind is always a scene, some lines that come to mind, and they usually have very little to do with the plot. That is some vivid moment stands out. Or to go back to my opera example, the greatest thing about the opera is the song. These beautiful arias or duets and quartets and whatnot that are sung. And frequently they don't have to do with anything all that important. They have to do with things that are aside from the main line of the argument, as it's called, of the story. Well, we'll have to belabor this point and come back to it again and again and again. The whole point about poetry is that it is, by definition, it works by accidental means. And we have to learn something about this. The poetry is an imitation of life, and life works by accidental means. What's important, finally, about our lives is not the great events. William Wordsworth has those famous lines. He says, "That best portion of a good man's life is little unremembered acts of kindness and of love." I probably haven't got that exactly right, but that's close.
There's one word missing, but I can't think of it.
I can't think what it is.
Unremembered, little. I don't know. That's
little unremembered, something unremembered acts of kindness and of love. Well, that's true, isn't it? That is, he calls that the best portion of a good man's life. The things that the good man himself doesn't even remember, and nobody else remembers. But that's the substance of the goodness of his life. When you make a summary of your life, you give the day you were born and the day you graduated from school and where you got your degrees, and then if you got married or you had a religious vocation or the telephone rang. That's an accident. Now I just got interrupted by a telephone here, which is an accident.
I think it's more like a catastrophe accident.
Well,
the bell rings. Well, it's like
I think it is
an emergency.
And it reminds me of something I think we were saying here either last time or the time before, that one of the things you have to remember is that these important things about our lives, these unimportant things about our lives may turn out to be important things about somebody else's life. That telephone call, for example, was about something very important to somebody else. Not to me, you see, but very important to somebody else. And to me, that's just an interruption. To us right now, that's just a nasty bell ringing, but it's part of somebody else's catastrophe. And we are involved in those things. So, yes, we have to belabor this point that the accidents are the best portion of the poem.
This is something that we tend not to pay any attention to. Increasingly in our times, there is a tendency to dismiss the accidents. That is to say things like, well, what difference does it make what kind of chair you have? Or for that matter, what difference does it make whether you have a chair or not? Why not just sit on the floor? I notice very frequently that young people, that is, people who are 18 or 19 years old, that is, college students, will, unless there is a chair immediately available, they will immediately sit on the floor. And I am always saying things like, well, here, let's find a chair and sit down. And they always say, oh, no, this is fine. I'll just sit on the floor. And you
As if it were a virtue. Really.
And you walk around the university and you see people sprawling out along the halls, sitting on the floor. Or you say the clothing that you wear doesn't make any difference. That's just an accident.
Come as you are.
Yeah, come as you are. Don't worry about your clothes. After all, they're not really important. The kind of cutlery you use when you eat. I mean, a paper plate and some plastic knives and forks they get the job done. What do we need all this fancy china and glassware and silverware for anyway? Those are accidentals. We don't have to have. Maybe we don't have to have plates and glasses and all that. We can just eat with our hands. We don't need all of that stuff. Let's get down to the essentials, and whatever will get the job done is sufficient, and do away with all of the frills. Those are just frills, and they're unnecessary.
I was trying to suggest something about this a moment ago, and I did it badly. I'm afraid I didn't find the right words for it when I said that some people mistake this and think we're talking about something fancy having to do with civilization in the book learning sense. That is, when you talk about a cultured person, it has echoes of what? Snobism. Yeah. You think of Marie Antoinette and the Hollywood version, that is, of Marie Antoinette, some sort of exaggerated foppery. We're not talking about that at all. We're talking about something very real here. Actually, this particular description, after all, is about a king's palace. And so much is made of the richness of the vessels, the gold and the silver. But there's another marvelous scene at the end of the poem where, when Odysseus comes back to Ithaca in disguise and puts up for the night at the swineherd's hut, Eumaeus's hut, and much is made of the breakfast that they eat the next morning. Now here we are, still seated, on a rude, handmade wooden bench in front of a rough-hewn table, but the chair and the table and the utensils are still there, and the courtesy and the refinement is still there, even though it's on a lower social level. That is, we're not talking here about something that has to do with the upper classes as opposed to the lower classes. We're talking about something that has to do with the whole of society. Good manners are changed slightly from class to class, that's true. Manners that are appropriate at court are not necessarily appropriate in a shepherd's hut, but there's good manners appropriate to each. And we're not, the distinction we're making here is not between something fancy and la-di-da and that sort of thing. Something phony. I think students used to use that word all the time. It was very popular 20 years ago to sneer at sitting on a chair. You know, in defense, I'll just sit on the floor. Only phonies want to sit on or dress well, or want to dress up for a certain occasion. When you do a certain thing, there's an appropriate dress for that certain thing. It's not hypocritical to dress well. Quite the contrary. There's a reverse and false hypocrisy for a student to sit on the floor. It may be necessary to sit on the floor sometimes, but it's false to sit there when you don't have to.
Yeah, and dressing well means, of course, always means dressing appropriately. Speaking well, in the sense of good manners, always means speaking appropriately. Odysseus talks to the swineherd, and he talks to his maids, and he speaks to his wife, and he doesn't talk to them all in the same way. And he also talks to Athena, to the goddess. He speaks in different ways, in appropriate ways. Everyone does this.
But he has good manners in each case.
But he always has good manners.
And when we started out this time talking about manners, saying that poetry is about manners. But remember now that when we use that word, we're going to be talking about all of the accidents of our lives. Manners have to do, strictly speaking, with our own personal behavior. But in the wide sense, customs and manners, culture has to do with all of the ways of our lives. Has to do with the way we eat and the way we live, the houses that we live in, the clothes that we wear. Finally, the collections of houses that we build in villages, the kinds of streets, the gardens, the cities, the nation. Everything that we do in a certain way. We talk about a way of life, or nowadays there's a vile phrase been coined for it. We call it lifestyle. The reason I say vile is because style implies, again, somehow that it's something unimportant, something that you can do or not do as you see fit, something that changes with the times and whatnot, something like mode or fashion. We use style in that sense, don't we? When someone says, well, he has a certain lifestyle, it's almost as if it came out of the latest issue of a magazine, that it was the latest fashion. Quite the contrary. The things that we're talking about are not style in that sense, but are the very foundation of civilization. When
lifestyle also always implies some idiosyncratic, something idiosyncratic that you adopt personally and on an individual basis. Yeah. In that case, that's simply a sign of the complete loss of manners, because manners,
they're customs,
and they
traditions.
They operate throughout a culture. You will notice later on, when Odysseus does begin telling the story, one of the places that he goes to is the land of the Cyclops, and the Cyclops are not civilized. There's a little passage there. I'm not going to stop to read it now, but there's a little passage there where Odysseus says, well, let's go up and see these people. Let's see who lives here on this island that we have come to. And let's see if they are civilized. He uses a word that means something like that. Or if they live, he says, if they live in houses and if they live in communities. Let's find out if these are really well-mannered people. Well, he finds out, of course, that they're not. They don't live in houses at all. They live in caves. They don't live in communities at all. They live isolated from one another. And they don't sit down at a table and eat. They're cannibals. They eat human beings. They are they are people who have no manners at all. They are savages, is what they are. And it isn't simply their moral condition that Odysseus is talking about at all, or that Homer is talking about. These are outstanding examples of a whole race of people who deviate radically from the common manners of civilization. That is, in other words, he expects no matter where he goes. Odysseus says, well, wherever you go in the world, whether the people are your own people or not, you expect civilized people to behave in a civilized way.
If someone wanted to talk about good and evil, wanted to talk about morals, but was dressed improperly, you might say, well, we'll talk about it sometime when you're better dressed. If people have not risen to the level of good manners, they simply are not ready to sit down and talk about the things of the mind.
I remember a friend telling me a story once about Oxford, where manners are at a very high level. Traditionally, they have been at a very high level. That is, the college student was expected to meet very high standards of manners in such things as dress. For example, this was a story about a young man who was going to see his tutor. Occasionally at Oxford or Cambridge, they have a tutor system, and you're assigned a tutor, and you go and talk to him occasionally about what you've been doing, what you've been reading or studying lately. And this young man, this really happened. This young man went up and knocked on his tutor's door, and the tutor came to the door, and he said that he had come to pay a visit. And the tutor looked at him. He looked at him. He started at the top and looked all the way down, and he had on brown shoes. And he looked
ways of doing things and courtesies and so forth. He attributes them to the Indians as well. And there's a lot of dispute about how accurate he was, but he certainly convinces his readers that he knew what he was talking about.
Well, that makes me think, too, of a point concerning manners, that is, you're talking about the West. One time I was laid up with a broken leg, and I didn't want to try to read anything very serious, and so I started reading Westerns. I read, 20 or 30 Westerns, lying in bed with a broken leg. And I read all kinds, I suppose you could call James Fenimore Cooper a sort of Western, kind of frontier novels. But I read things like Owen Wister, for example, who wrote The Virginian, which is a kind of classic Western novel. And then I read Zane Grey and a lot of other Westerns. And one of the things that I noticed was that the quality of the book increased as the presence of manners as a subject increased in the novel.
You mean if you get down to the pulp stories?
The cheapest stories always dispense with the manners, not just the manners of the most obvious sense of manners, courtesy and that sort of thing, but all the paraphernalia, the horses and the equipment and the clothing and the way of life. As you get to closer and closer to pulp literature, all of those things vanish.
The action takes over.
Yeah, it's true in, say, mystery stories. Anything that you read, the action simply becomes the be-all and end-all of the story, and all of the manners vanish altogether. Whereas the very best, to the contrary, where the manners are most prominent, you are always in the presence of a much more serious kind of literature. That's really a kind of rule of thumb, and you might find exceptions to it, but I don't think so. I think really it's a general rule that manners really dominate the best literature, the best poetry. And they certainly dominate the Odyssey.
Which is the best poetry.
Yes.
And all poems, in one way or another, all stories are imitations of the Odyssey. If you pick up a novel of James Fenimore Cooper or move to a Western by Zane Grey, you're going to be reading the Odyssey over again in some way or another. You're going to find a young man setting out on an adventure, for example, at the beginning of the story. Or you're going to find an older person coming home. There really aren't very many stories to tell. There may be a half a dozen of them, and they're told over and over again in different places, in different times, in different settings. The same stories, and always the eye of the poet, if he's any good, if the story is any good, the eye of the poet is going to be on those millions of inessential details which turn out to be everything in the story. After all, when you read those Westerns, what is it that you like about them? You just want to live that life. That's what you like about it. Wouldn't it be wonderful to go out and get on a horse and go riding over the plains and come up to that ranch house? That's what you want to do.
You want to wear those kinds of hats, and those kinds of boots,
spurs,
all that marvelous equipment, gear, all that wonderful gear.
The same thing is true of the sea stories. You pick up a story of Robert Louis Stevenson, and you're out there on the ocean with the pirate ship, and what a wonderful life it really is. The plot really turns out to be just an excuse to get us into living this particular life. But now, let's again block a possible error here. We're not talking about anything exotic. We're not reading Homer here as a way of archaeology. We're not reading Homer here in order to find out what the Greeks were like. Quite the contrary. We become Greeks, or the Greeks turn out to be us. When you get into any good story, it very quickly becomes your own story. That is, there's a certain kind of a writer who gets onto the idea that the inessentials are important, and then he piles on all kinds of detail in, I like to call it, an archaeological way. That is, he tries to build up a kind of case history for the way those people were as different from us. And the point of the story is like reading the National Geographic magazine. That is, you're taking a trip to some exotic place that you don't know anything about, and the whole point of it is you want to be dazzled and shocked and surprised by all the differences. That doesn't happen in any good story. You very quickly get into an Owen Wister Western. You do really become the cowboy, and you forget that you're not. You take part in the story, and it becomes very quickly your own story. And that's certainly true about the Odyssey. Telemachus is every young man of 20 years old who's starting out on an adventure. It's your story, we always say to our college students. This story, this part of the story, is about you. And everybody recognizes that. When you started out on your adventure, even such an adventure as leaving home and going off to college, didn't you go through that last night at home? Didn't you, go to bed in your own little bed that you have been living in as a child, sleeping in as a child? And didn't you stay awake hour after hour thinking about what you were going to do? Get on an aeroplane and go off to some far place, some adventure, some unknown danger that you can't calculate. As it says here, turning it over in his mind, trying to imagine what the journey was going to be like. That turns out to be your particular story, not as different, but as the same. I think Mr. Quinn used the phrase just a moment ago, talking about manners as opposed to style, that they're not idiosyncratic. They're part of the whole culture. They're part of the whole tradition. And when you read the Odyssey, there's one thing that's very clear. There is only one civilization of which we are a part.
Yeah, that word, the word culture has become a treacherous word. So many words have become treacherous.
It's like inflation.
Now, when we use culture, we tend to mean there are two false meanings of the word culture. One of them means culture with a kind of as something snobbish. A cultivated person is someone who goes to the opera and likes to go to museums and wears very stylish clothes. Yeah, pretentiousness. Or, on the other hand, culture is used in the sense of a particular culture, like Greek culture or Roman culture or Hungarian culture, that is in an anthropological sense. And we don't mean the word in either one of these senses. Mr. Senior ended by saying there really is one civilization. Civilization is used in the same way. Civilization can either mean in that kind of foppish way of being kind of over-civilized, sometimes we say, or it can be used anthropologically. That is, that the Hindus have their culture, have their civilization, and the Bantus have their civilization. We don't mean the word in that way at all. There is one culture and there is one civilization, and it's present in the Odyssey, and it is still present in the world that we live in now.
We may be losing it.
Well, yes, I was going to add a reservation about that. It's vanishing.
Although it's had its ups and downs.
Yeah.
It hasn't been it's always been there for over 3,000 years, but it's had its ups and downs within those 3,000.
Well, right, but any time someone knocks on your door and you invite someone in and you say, well, here, sit down, have a chair. You say, well, you're just doing exactly what Telemachus did. You're part of that culture.
A young fellow just came to the door here about an hour ago, and he said that he was a student taking a survey of people who had school-age children. And he looked like a student. He was student's age. And he had a notebook there and a pencil and everything. And I said, well, I don't have any school-age children. He looked at me and he said, oh, yeah. He said, I can see that. And but he said, that's all right. He said, we don't have to bother with all this. What I'm really doing is, then he dug down and he got out some books he was selling. See, that was just a gag. And he started selling me some kind of encyclopedia, the usual thing. And I said, no, I don't want any, no. And he kept right on talking with the spiel, and I couldn't stop him. And I finally said, now look, you're going to make me shut the door in your face, But I felt ashamed to do that.
Yeah.
Even under those circumstances.
Sure.
But I was ready to do it.
Well, there are times when.
But he was abusing the privilege.
Yes, he's abusing your hospitality. There are times when these are subtleties. People come to my door sometime, my office door, and if I really do want to see them, I say, come in and sit down. But sometimes I don't really want to see them, and they're sort of intruding, and I talk to them, but I don't ask them to sit down. And they know right away. They stand, and I stand, and then they begin to feel a little uncomfortable. They realize that I am not going to sit down and talk to them, and they say, after a few minutes, they say goodbye, and they go away. These things are very deep, and they are not, even though we have tended in our times to abandon courtesy, manners, all of the mores, the customary decorum, we call it. All of those things tend to be played down in our own times, but nevertheless, they're still present. They're very definitely present.
Well, we've touched on the danger in our time that we're going to lose this civilization, and we touched upon the great topic of the hour. The crisis in civilization, the crisis in our culture. Well, the crisis in everything. Remember, somebody wrote the funny book called The Decline and Fall of Practically Everything, because there were so many declines and falls. But now it isn't really decline and fall, it's crisis, isn't it? That is, everyone sees it in everything. That is, there's a crisis in the law, there's a crisis in medicine, there's
family, religion,
everything. So we stop and say, all right, then what are we going to do about the crisis in civilization? And people come forward with various proposals. One of them is education, for example. There are those who say, well, what we have to do is teach students. We have to get better textbooks, and we have to give people a course in civilization. One of the things that colleges do all over the United States, this has been done. Well, let's set up a course called Civilization, and we'll teach the students about civilization. Well, see, what we're proposing here is that that's not what civilization is. If you give somebody a course in the history of civilization, you're not civilizing the person. That is to try to take out the plot again, the historical plot, and talk about the Greeks and the Romans and the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and to give high points, the poetry of Homer, the poetry of Virgil, the paintings of the Renaissance. And then, you see, that's how to cure the disease of modern times. That's how to solve the problem of the crisis of civilization. We're proposing here that really that's not true at all. There isn't any intellectual solution to the problem, because it's not a problem. It's a loss of a sensibility, and the only way to get it back is to go back to the beginning and to try, as strange as it may seem, to try to go back and learn those habits again.
Yeah, those courses in civilization, as they call it, always stress the peculiarities of past cultures. They always regard the past, no matter how recent it may be, but of course if it's very far away, it's even more so. They always treat the past as something completely remote from us. And they pick out those things that are peculiar, and they emphasize the difference between the people and their ways in the past and the way we are now. And of course there are differences. You can always find differences, great differences sometimes.
Well, we don't have anybody named Telemachus much. I mean, some of these Greek names are hard to read sometimes. Things like that.
Well, we don't have the Greek. They don't have those Greek gods around.
No.
People are all. But the tendency is to say, to always preface everything about an ancient poem with saying, well, back in those days, people thought that something, something, something. Back in those days, people had these customs, these habits, and they're nothing like us at all.
We get to have an annotated text with footnotes explaining who the gods were and what these various terms meant and all that sort of thing. And again, that's exactly wrong.
And so we say, well, it not only doesn't it civilize, it actually has the opposite effect. It has the effect of alienating us from the whole tradition that we have come up with. This is our tradition. This is part of our tradition. You might say it's the beginning of our tradition. It's one of the earliest items in our tradition. And if it is alien to us, or we are alien to it, and if we find that that's the same thing is true of the Aeneid, or the same thing is true of Plato, then what we gain from reading books in the past is a feeling that they really have nothing to do with us at all. That it's simply a record of dead events and irrelevant ways.
I know one of the first assignments that we give our students is, having read, say, book 1 of the Odyssey, is to say to them, all right, now between now and next time, whatever that is, whenever the class meets again, what we want you to do is become aware of the accidents of your existence. That is, when you walk out of this room, see what happens if you just pay attention to everything that you normally would not pay attention to. Look around you and notice all these things that Homer would have noticed if he were telling a story. Take a look at everything around you and take a look at yourself. Write a kind of poem about yourself as you walk around through life in the next few days. Become aware of your surroundings. Try to key up your recognition of things, notice things, because that's really what poets begin with. All knowledge begins with the senses, Aristotle says. And so many people in philosophy classes read that and they say, oh yeah, that's right, and then they very quickly forget it. That is, having learned it as a philosophical principle, they then go on to the next stage. But what we assign our students is this. It turns out to be very difficult. Most of them really have a hard time doing it. To care about the things that you normally don't care about at all.
Well, if you don't have the habit of doing it, it's very hard to get.
You can't do it. You can't do it in 1 minute.
No, it's very difficult. We've noticed it over the years, and anyone can notice it. When someone comes to my home and comes into my home, I judge them unconsciously. I don't sit down and consciously make a judgment about them. But when they're gone, I tend to judge them by what they noticed. For example, I happen to have a pet rabbit sitting in a cage in a main room of my house. You can't miss it. It's right there. It's a great big cage, and you can't miss it. And it's surprising that there are people who come in to my house who don't notice that rabbit. It's very striking. I mean, not very many people have a great big, a rather beautiful rabbit sitting in the middle of their living room, and there it is. And there are people, I swear, who go away that if someone said to them, did you notice anything, any animals or anything like that, they'd say, well, no, as a matter of fact, I didn't. I can tell that they don't even see that rabbit, or many other things. Whereas exactly the opposite is true of other people. They sit down and you watch their eyes. As they talk, they look around the room. They notice the pictures on the wall. They notice the rabbit. They may say, well, what kind of a rabbit is that? How old is that rabbit? Isn't that a beautiful rabbit? What's his name? It's a genuine kind of spontaneous interest in what's going on around them. We used to notice, especially about students. I remember once we had a group of students in my office, and there was a bowl of flowers sitting on the table right in the middle of the office. And we got to talking about this thing about noticing things, and we started to ask people if they had noticed anything in the room. And it took us probably 10 minutes before anybody said, well, there's a bowl of flowers sitting on the table.
We'd asked, was there anything beautiful?
Anything especially striking or beautiful or noticeable?
Because it was otherwise a rather typical university.
Yeah, it wasn't much to be said for it.
Kind of a nondescript university office in one of these modern buildings, but the flowers were strikingly beautiful.
And it was quite clear that they hadn't really noticed them. They were, they thought they were being examined or something of that sort, and they were nervous and they were worried, and they thought that they ought to be sort of concentrating their thoughts or something of that sort. But they just did not have this habit of noticing things.
Well, they thought they were going to be examined on the plot, whatever it was.
Yes.
Yes. I think actually that was before the course got started, but it would have been on the plot of their own lives or on their preparation or something plot. Again, is a word that doesn't just apply to stories, but applies to life. And when we come to a certain crisis, we tend to concentrate on the plot. But the poet teaches us otherwise. Well, to make a long story short, which is a hard thing, impossible thing to do, if someone said, what can we do about the crisis of civilization? We would say, well, you've got to acquire certain habits. And you're not going to do it overnight. It's something that calls for patience, for sticking to it, pertinacity.
Well, and of course it requires a kind of, it requires this thing that we call leisure.
Letting go.
Kind of letting go.
Yeah.
You can't sort of concentrate. You can't say, okay, now I'm going to, in this room I'm going to notice 10 items.
Well, then you become an archaeologist.
I'm going to make a list of the items. When I get home, I'm going to put them all down in numerical order.
No, that's what the archaeologist does. He piles up all that detail again, and it doesn't do it at all.
No, it has to be leisurely. It has to be a kind of careless noticing of things. It's not systematic at all. It isn't relevant to anything that happens to be going on around you. It's simply letting your eye rove and taking things in.
Well, that is kind of strange, isn't it? That is, we've distinguished the accidental from the essential. And the things we're talking about are accidental, but now we have to distinguish among accents, because Homer doesn't describe everything, does he?
Oh, no.
That is, he picks out a certain kind of detail. We call it significant detail. Now, the word significant has to do with the word sign. It's a sign of something. A sign points to some meaning. What is it that it points to? That is, when you go over these details, the stranger standing at the gate. Gee, stop there. How many stories have you read in your life? Have there been strangers standing at gates?
Talk about westerns.
That's
all westerns start that way. Almost invariably, there is a stranger in town.
I mean, it doesn't have to do in this case so much with the plot, because it isn't Odysseus, but it does have to do with something immensely significant and especially mysterious. There's something mysterious about the details that Homer picks on. He picks on ordinary things, but they have a certain valence. They have a charge, a kind of an electrical charge, which is inexplicable. Again, we go back to that definition that Robinson gave of poetry, that it's, now I've forgotten it again. It's indefinable, but unmistakable.
Yeah.
Indefinable but unmistakable. That is, Homer will pick on a detail, and you can't explain why he picked on that detail, but it's unmistakable that it was the right detail. It isn't, as Mr. Quinn was saying, it should make a list of everything in the room. If you walk into that room you're talking about there in your house, by golly, there's the rabbit. I mean, it isn't everything in the room, you know. There are other things there, but certain things will stand out, and the poet has an eye not for every detail, but for the right detail, the significant detail. A gesture, for example, that a person makes, a certain look. If you were describing a person, you don't describe everything. Give his height and his weight and his dimensions and name all the items of clothing. No. You just pick out the one thing which is characteristic. You say, that's Joe.
Yeah, you see, a person, again, a stranger in someone's house, they're looking around because they want to understand. There is a desire there to understand, to come to know this place and the people that are in this place, and so they look around for something that will tell them something. A sign tells you something. The significant thing tells you something. And they pick on the rabbit because it's rather extraordinary, and they want to know the story. They say, well, how did you come to get that anyway, and why do you keep it here? That's kind of a strange thing. There must be something about you that thing tells me. They're puzzled about it, but they picked out something. But it may be something else. It might be something quite insignificant, or apparently insignificant.
It turns out you can't explain it either.
No.
I mean, if it's mysterious.
Yes.
There are two things. It's significant and mysterious. There are some signs. Again, you have to distinguish. There are two kinds of sign. Maybe there are three or four, but there are at least two. One kind of sign has an immediate explanation. And as you see an arrow pointing in a certain direction, you say, well, that's the way to wherever it is that we're going. Or you see a red light and you say, well, it means to stop. But then there are certain things and you say, well, no, he gave her a significant look. Well, what? Significant of what? Well, nobody knows. See, it's a mystery. The eyes are mysterious orbs. They look in certain ways, and we don't know what it means, but we know that it's significant. We know that it has a meaning. A mystery is something which is very clearly significant. That is, it's striking. A mystery is something that strikes you as being significant, but at the same time you don't know significant of what. I think that's as good a definition of a mystery as you're going to get. It has to be something striking. It has to be something that has a meaning, but you don't know what the meaning is. It has that double quality there. And the stranger at the gate has about it that mysterious yearning towards some idea that we can't possibly grasp. And the worst thing in the world you can do is to explain it, to translate it.
You can see this. You can see the mystery involved in it right away. Telemachus says he wants to ask. He says he wished to question him about his absent father, this stranger. He doesn't know who this man is, who is Pallas Athena in disguise, but this stranger who appears there for no reason and no explanation. It's something very striking, and you can see that Telemachus is already wondering about it. He says he's going to ask him about his father. Well, the man has come from somewhere, and he thinks, well, maybe he knows something. Maybe he knows something. Well, he does. Of course, this is Pallas Athena. Well, we know that she knows. She knows where his father is.
It is true, isn't it, though, that do you suppose some strangers are Pallas Athena in disguise? That is, you meet a lot of strangers. Maybe even in a day, you may meet more than you know. You don't think much about it, but
yes.
You go downtown and go to the post office, and there are strangers there all over the place. But suppose one of them were a god or a goddess. That notion that a stranger may be a god in disguise permeates this literature.
Well, in the Christian tradition, we say an angel in disguise, don't we? We say that that might be an angel in disguise. In fact, that used to be one of the standard explanations for the reason to treat strangers well. You don't know who that stranger might be. You know the story of Samson or Samson's mother, who is at home, and this stranger suddenly comes up to her and tells her that she's going to have a child, and she's astonished, and she just thinks it's a man. She doesn't realize that it's an angel that's come to her to tell her. She runs out into the fields. She tells her husband. She says, "This man came in and he said, I'm going to have a child. Come back and meet him." She says. And they invite him. Again, they invite him to eat, and he says, "Well, I don't really eat." They suddenly realize they're in the presence of an angel. has come to give them
That
a message.
similar thing happens in Tobias.
Yes,
the angel
it happens all the time.
It happens all the time.
They offer it. They want to thank him at the end of the adventure, and they say, "We're going to. What can we give you? Can we give you something to eat?" He says, "Well, no, no, we can't."
But of course, the question comes up over and over again: who are these gods? And they are something. I think consensus is that they are angels. Alas, since this is a pagan religion, it must be that they're fallen angels. We don't know. If we dwell on the Christian criticism, as it were, of this literature, we're likely again to get into a kind of study which is no longer poetry. I think we just have to take them as they are in the poem and as Odysseus took them. Let's say that the literature, the science of this question, what are the gods? Cicero has a whole book on it. For example, in the ancient world, it was debated. The ancients themselves weren't sure who these creatures were, and they came up with the same explanations that we tend to come up with. Some people thought that they were legends, that is, fictions. Some people thought that they were angels. Some people thought that they were people, spirits, returned, spirits of the dead, ghosts, in other words. There are various explanations for what these gods are, but we're not interested in explanations. We can just put that in a parenthesis and put it aside. But certainly they are spiritual beings, and in that sense they belong to the angelic orders. Now, as I say, the overwhelming probability that when a Christian examines the question, he has to say, well, they're Athena. If you study Greek religion, you have to say that Athena was some kind of a devil. But she doesn't appear in this poem as a devil. She appears in this poem as a friend to Odysseus, and within the context of this poem, her presence is benign. That's a possibility. That is, a devil can do good work for that particular reason and for that particular occasion. So we can simply take Athena as Athena in this poem. But
a devil can tell the truth, for example.
Yes.
The devil can tell the truth.
And God uses them for his purpose in the course of history. And Athena played a great role in the history of the church. There's no question. That is, Athens was founded in her name, and she and Apollo especially, the two most important of the Greek gods in terms of Christian culture. There's no question about that. And it may very well be that the inspirations for that culture were given to us through the instrumentality of fallen angels. God, in his wisdom, made use of them for that reason, which is not to say that they didn't have their wicked aspects and that Greece didn't have to be converted, as it did have to be, in order to live. But we're now back before the coming of Christ, and we're moving through the Athenian dispensation, if you will. That is, Athena is the tutelary goddess of this particular poem. You can criticize her, but it's also true that, in a sense, you can convert her. You can't convert her, but you can convert her followers. One of the best ways of making that clear is that when the Christian, when the apostles and in the generation after the apostles, when the missionaries converted in a particular place, they most frequently went to the temple. You remember when we were in Greece, we visited a convent, which is a Greek Orthodox community today. but which had a continuous existence, this particular convent, all the way back, and it was founded on a place where a miraculous spring existed, and where there had been the worship of a virgin goddess. And Christians came along and said, well, this is a mistaken, twisted way of understanding, and so they turned it around and it became a convent dedicated to the Virgin Mary. But the original place, it had been a place where virgin girls had a kind of a pagan convent, and that had been going on for 1,000 years before it had been converted. And that story is repeated over and over and over again. Wasn't Chartres itself founded on, I think it was, founded on such a place? The stories are legion all over Christendom. That the place to found a church or a cathedral or a convent or a monastery would be precisely to go to the place where there had been some kind of mystery going on before. It was a mystery which had been taught in an inverted way, but which nonetheless contained truth. As Mr. Quinn said, the devil can teach the truth. And in a way, these devils were teaching the truth. Despite themselves, they were giving witness to the truth. So I think it's a wonderful thing to give your heart to Athena as you read this poem, just as you do to Odysseus and to Telemachus, knowing full well that, of course, you're not giving your whole heart to it. There are people, I guess, who get converted to paganism through an overindulgence in Greek literature, but I don't know about that. It seems to me that people who do that are the ones who are making that mistake of treating it as something exotic, as something as other than ourselves. When you were talking about that a mistaken way of handling the past, there are those who have a sort of a wistful sense of the beauty of it all. Wasn't it wonderful? The pagans had such a beautiful life, and ours is so sordid and so crass, and they sort of go back into it and become pagans by design. But if you take a look at civilization as a living thing, and you say, well, these people were converted. That is, the Odyssey is a preparation for the conversion of the Greco-Roman world in the time of the apostles.
That was what I was going to say, is that the Greek, the flowering of the Greek particular manifestation of culture that we call Greek culture played a very decisive role in the conversion of the world. Nobody knows how all of this happened. That is, the Greeks. It's a great mystery. Where they came from, even in archaeological terms, where did these people come from? Why is it that this extraordinary race of people suddenly appeared in history and wrote these magnificent poems? Everybody agrees.
There's nothing like the Odyssey anywhere else in the world.
No, you can't compare it to the Egyptians or any of the ancient peoples. And not only poetry, of course, but philosophy and science, Plato and Aristotle, and
politics,
and the whole political life and cultural life. All of those things, art and painting and music and all of that, suddenly appeared here with these people. Now, absolutely nobody can explain that. And out of that came Roman civilization. That is, that the Romans simply followed, in many, many ways, simply followed the Greeks. These are commonplaces of history. That this is the foundation of everything that we call Western civilization or Western culture, and that it was in that cradle that that Christianity was born, and that that this constitutes a sort of preparation for the conversion of the world. It wasn't simply achieved by a kind of sudden intrusion out of nowhere of the divine word. There was a preparation made through the world. And the Greeks obviously have a very, very large role to play in that. It's very easy to talk about this in connection with, let's say, with Greek philosophy. When we come to talk about Greek philosophy, it's something we might mention. It's not quite so obvious when you talk about poetry, but nevertheless, it's still very, very clear. You see, this goes back to our point about manners preceding morals.
Well, Greek philosophy obviously is impossible without Greek poetry.
Yes, it comes first.
And Christian theology is impossible without Greek philosophy.
I was noticing the other day that both of the academy that was founded by Plato was founded in a place that was dedicated to the gods. That is to, and especially to poetry. That is to celebrations, to feasts in celebration of the gods, and that the same is true of the place where the Lyceum. The Lyceum actually was a temple dedicated to Apollo. Apollo, of course, is the leader of the Muses, particularly a god of music. That musical background you find mysteriously embedded at the beginning of philosophy. And you find it at the end, too. I was also noticing that Aristotle at the end of his life, was banished from Athens. He died far away from Athens and his students and friends. And at the end of his life, there's a little fragment that we have from somewhere that's authentic, apparently, that said, it quotes Aristotle as saying that as I become more isolated and more lonely, I am more and more drawn to the love of myth, story, poetry. He's there. We can see him, an old man in retirement, thinking over, remembering the myths, remembering the poetry that he learned as a very young man. There's an intimate connection between poetry and philosophy. And poetry comes first. There isn't any question about that. And it remains. Philosophy doesn't come along and replace it.
It comes back.
Socrates, in the cell where he was to die, in the very last hours of his death, in the Phaedo comes in and he says, "What have you been? I hear Socrates. He says that you've been writing poetry. What is this, Hemingway? Why are you doing that?" And he says, "Well, the God has always told me that I am supposed to make music." And he says, "I've always interpreted that as meaning that I should study philosophy, because philosophy," he says, "is the highest form of music." But he says, "I've gotten a little worried about it here since I'm going to die in a few hours, and so I have been actually composing, or what I've been doing is translating the fables of Aesop," that's the myths in Greek, the myths of Aesop, into verse. And also he composed an ode to Apollo, hymn to Apollo, there in his very last days. There as he died, the greatest of the very beginner of all Greek philosophy was there composing poetry in his very last days.